when 16-year-old Amara confronted a bully who mocked her skin tone in front of the entire cafeteria. She didn't just stand up for herself. She inspired her classmates to question their own silence. Her courage sparked conversations about respect, inclusion, and the power of speaking out, changing her school in ways no one expected. The lunchroom at Jefferson High in Denver, Colorado, was a chaotic symphony of clinking trays, bursts of laughter, and animated conversations. The cafeteria, a sprawling space filled with long rectangular tables, was divided like a patchwork quilt by unspoken rules. Athletes dominated the middle section, their laughter and banter loud and carefree. The theater kids claimed the far corner, where exaggerated gestures and dramatic retellings of weekend auditions were commonplace. Other groups, nerds, artists, and those who simply floated between cliques, staked out their little pockets of safety amidst the noise. Near a window at the far side of the room, Amara, a 16-year-old junior, sat alone. She liked this spot, where sunlight streamed through the glass, highlighting the golden undertones of her dark brown skin and catching the light in the coiled strands of her neatly tied back curls. Amara's table wasn't entirely isolated, but it offered her enough distance to observe without being drawn into the fray. She enjoyed the quiet, the way it allowed her to think, to dream, without the chaos pressing in too tightly. On her tray sat a container of steaming jambalaya, the spicy aroma rising to meet her as she popped open the lid. Her mother, a chef at a local Creole restaurant, had insisted on packing her lunch that morning, saying, "You need real food, not those soggy sandwiches from the cafeteria." The flavors reminded Amara of home, of the Sunday dinners filled with laughter and storytelling. As Amara took her first bite, her eyes wandered to the courtyard outside. The trees swayed gently in the early autumn breeze, their leaves beginning to shift from green to hues of orange and red. It was her favorite time of year, when the air felt crisp but not yet biting, and the world seemed to glow with possibility. But even in this moment of peace, a familiar undercurrent of unease lingered. Jefferson High was a predominantly white school, and being one of the few black students in her grade often left Amara feeling like she stood out in ways she didn't want to. Her confidence was sometimes mistaken for arrogance, her natural curls for something exotic, her laughter for something too loud. It wasn't always overt, but the subtle reminders of her otherness were constant, like a low hum in the background of her daily life. Amara had learned to navigate these waters with quiet grace, blending in when necessary, retreating to her corner when the weight of being different felt too heavy. She wasn't ashamed of who she was, far from it. But high school had taught her that survival often meant choosing her battles carefully. And today felt like a day for peace. Across the room, the usual clamor of voices filled the air. Amara caught snippets of conversation, someone gossiping about a football game, another recounting a party that had apparently gone sideways. She smiled faintly at the absurdity of it all. High school drama was a world she tried to avoid, preferring instead to lose herself in books, music, or the occasional sketch in her notebook. She was halfway through her meal when she heard the laughter. At first, it blended with the rest of the cafeteria noise, just another burst of humor from one of the many tables. But then it grew louder, sharper, cutting through the din like a blade. Amara's muscles tensed instinctively. She didn't need to look to know where it was coming from. At a table not far from hers, Tyler and his group of friends were gathered. Tyler, a junior like Amara, was known for his quick wit and sharp tongue. He wasn't the class clown. That title belonged to someone far less mean-spirited, but Tyler had a knack for finding people's insecurities and turning them into punchlines. His friends, a mix of wannabe alpha males and insecure followers, ate it up, their laughter a constant echo of his cruelty. Amara kept her head down, focusing on her food, but the tension in her body betrayed her calm exterior. She had been in this position before, the unspoken target of whispered jokes and sideways glances. She knew the pattern, the setup, the punchline, the laughter. It was a script she had memorized but never volunteered to perform in. She could feel their eyes on her now, the way their conversation shifted, the pauses punctuated by glances in her direction. The laughter grew louder, more pointed, and Amara's stomach tightened. She kept her focus on the view outside, willing herself to disappear into the fall colors. But the words came anyway, sharp and clear, slicing through her resolve. She probably scrubs her skin raw trying to get lighter. Tyler's voice carried across the room, loud enough for her to hear but framed as though he wasn't speaking to her at all. But I guess some stains just don't come out." The laughter that followed was like nails on a chalkboard. Amara froze, her fork hovering mid-air. Her heart raced, the sting of the words settling deep in her chest. She could feel the weight of the room shifting, the subtle shift in energy as students turned their attention to the spectacle. Some pretended not to notice, their heads down in feigned distraction. Others looked openly, curiosity and discomfort etched on their faces. For a moment, Amara considered letting it slide, swallowing the hurt and allowing the moment to pass as she always had. After all, wasn't it easier to stay invisible, to blend into the background? But something inside her resisted. The words lingered, heavier than usual, their cruelty too deliberate to ignore. Amara set her fork down slowly, her movements measured, deliberate. She exhaled, steadying herself. The room buzzed around her, but in her mind, everything narrowed to a single choice: stay silent or stand up. The sunlight streaming through the window caught her face as she looked up, her warm brown eyes steady and unyielding. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something bigger, something that demanded she find her voice. And this time, she decided, she wasn't going to fade into the background. Amara's decision solidified in her mind as she sat up straighter, her shoulders squaring. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to maintain control. The sting of Tyler's words was still fresh, but she wasn't about to let him or anyone else see her falter. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table for a moment before she calmly pushed her tray to the side. She stood, the sound of her chair scraping against the tiled floor cutting through the noisy cafeteria like a fire alarm. The room seemed to shift as her movement caught the attention of students nearby. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and even those who had been oblivious to Tyler's taunts moments before now paused to watch. The cacophony of the cafeteria began to soften, curiosity and tension replacing the usual din. Amara turned, her eyes locking onto Tyler's table. Tyler, lounging back in his chair like a king surrounded by his court, had a smug grin plastered across his face. His blonde hair was tousled in the way that looked effortless but was clearly intentional, and he was wearing his usual varsity jacket, the emblem of Jefferson High stitched on the sleeve. The confidence he exuded was the kind born of privilege, the kind that made him think he could say or do whatever he wanted without consequence. When Amara's gaze met his, Tyler's grin widened. "Oh, she's standing up now," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter, Amara? Can't take a joke?" The group around him chuckled, though their laughter wasn't as loud or as certain as before. A few of his friends exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the air making it harder to hide behind their leader's bravado. Amara's heart was pounding, but her face remained calm, her expression unreadable. She took a measured step forward, the soles of her sneakers making a soft but deliberate sound against the tile. Each step she took seemed to tighten the silence, like the strings of a violin being pulled taut. By the time she reached Tyler's table, the room was almost entirely still. Tyler leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His smirk hadn't wavered, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes now, uncertainty, perhaps, or the realization that he might have underestimated her. "What's wrong, Tyler?" Amara asked, her voice steady but cutting. "You don't look so confident anymore." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cafeteria. The tables closest to the confrontation were completely silent, students hanging on every word. Amara's voice wasn't loud, but it carried, her tones slicing through the air with a precision that commanded attention. Tyler laughed, though it sounded forced. "Confident? Please. I'm just wondering what's taking you so long to say something. Usually you're so quiet." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Quiet doesn't mean weak, Tyler. But I think you already know that. You just hoped I wouldn't call you out." The murmurs grew louder, a wave of whispers passing through the room. Tyler shifted in his seat, his confident facade beginning to crack. His friends looked less sure of themselves now, their smirks fading as they avoided meeting Amara's gaze. "I'm just being honest," Tyler said, leaning back again in an attempt to regain control of the situation. "If you can't handle a little truth, that's not my problem." Amara took another step closer to the table, her movements deliberate and composed. "Honesty? That's what you call what you said?" "No, Tyler. That wasn't honesty. That was cruelty disguised as a joke, and it's the oldest trick in the book. You wanted to humiliate me, and you thought no one would stand up to you. But here's the thing, you picked the wrong person." The room was silent now, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Even the lunch monitors, who usually stayed detached from the students' drama, were watching from their station by the door, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Tyler opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced around the table, looking for support from his friends, but they avoided his eyes. Even Ryan, his closest friend, was staring down at his tray, his shoulders hunched as if he wanted to disappear. Amara's gaze swept over the group before returning to Tyler. "You think tearing me down makes you look strong? It doesn't. It makes you look scared. Scared of what you don't understand, scared of anyone who doesn't fit into your narrow little definition of normal." A soft gasp came from somewhere in the crowd, followed by a murmur of agreement. Amara's words weren't just cutting through Tyler's bravado, they were resonating with the students around them, many of whom had felt the sting of similar taunts, even if they'd never had the courage to stand up for themselves. Tyler's smirk was gone now, replaced by a scowl. "You're overreacting," he muttered, his voice lower now, almost defensive. "It was just a joke." Amara shook her head, a faint, sad smile playing on her lips. "That's the excuse people like you always use, isn't it? It's just a joke. But jokes aren't funny when they're built on someone else's pain. And the fact that you can't see that says more about you than it does about me." For a moment, no one moved. The cafeteria felt frozen, the weight of Amara's words hanging in the air. Tyler looked down at the table, his face flushed with embarrassment. His friends were silent, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. Amara straightened, her shoulders square and her chin held high. She turned to address the room, her voice rising just enough to carry. "If you're sitting here watching this and thinking it's not your problem, it is. Every time you stay silent when someone like Tyler thinks he can get away with this, you're letting it happen. Silence isn't neutral. It's a choice." The room was completely still, the students hanging on her every word. Amara's gaze swept over them, her expression both fierce and compassionate. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than, simply for being who they were. Finally, she turned back to Tyler. "You don't get to define me. I define myself, and if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time you took a long, hard look in the mirror." With that, she stepped back, her movements calm and deliberate. The silence stretched for a moment longer before it was broken by a single, hesitant clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the applause grew, spreading across the cafeteria like a wave. Amara didn't smile, didn't bask in the moment. She simply returned to her table, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She had done what she needed to do. What happened next wasn't up to her, it was up to them. As the applause rippled through the cafeteria, Amara sat back down at her table, her hands trembling slightly beneath the surface of her composure. She reached for her fork but hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on her. She could feel the stares, the admiration from some, the curiosity from others, and the quiet disapproval of those who thought she had gone too far. The cafeteria was still buzzing, the whispers loud enough to blend into a low hum of energy. Amara exhaled deeply, her heart still pounding, but she refused to let it show. Tyler sat at his table, his face flushed and his jaw clenched. The smug confidence he had carried just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He glanced around, searching for support, but his friends were unusually quiet. Ryan, his best friend, avoided his gaze entirely, pretending to be engrossed in the contents of his tray. Maddie, one of the girls in Tyler's group, finally broke the silence at their table. "Tyler, maybe you should just," she started, but he cut her off with a sharp glare. "Don't," he snapped, his voice low and tense. "I don't need a lecture." But Maddie didn't look convinced. Her gaze flicked toward Amara's table, then back to Tyler, a flicker of something like guilt crossing her face. She didn't say anything else, but her body language screamed discomfort as she shifted awkwardly in her seat. Across the cafeteria, the applause began to fade, replaced by pockets of hushed conversation. Some students were clearly impressed by Amara's courage, their whispers filled with admiration. Others dismissed the moment as unnecessary drama, their tone laced with skepticism or disdain. A few students, particularly those who had experienced Tyler's sharp tongue themselves, seemed almost emboldened, their expressions thoughtful as they glanced at him, and then back at Amara. At the far end of the room, two lunch monitors stood near the exit, their eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Mrs. Sanders, a stern but fair woman in her 50s, had been working at Jefferson High for over a decade. She leaned closer to Mr. Patel, a younger staff member who was relatively new to the school. "That girl," Mrs. Sanders murmured, nodding toward Amara. "She's got guts. I've seen Tyler pull this kind of nonsense for years, but no one's ever stood up to him like that." Mr. Patel adjusted his glasses, his expression contemplative. "Do you think we should step in? I mean, it didn't get physical, but—" "No," Mrs. Sanders replied firmly. "Sometimes kids need to work things out on their own, but we'll keep an eye on it. This might be the wake-up call Tyler needs." As Amara resumed eating her lunch, a few students began to approach her table. The first was a girl named Olivia, someone Amara recognized from her English class but had never spoken to before. Olivia was quiet, usually blending into the background, but now she stood at the edge of Amara's table, her tray clutched tightly in her hands. "Hey," Olivia said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the lingering chatter in the room. That was really brave, what you did. I just wanted to say thank you. I mean, not just for yourself, but for like all of us." Amara looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she replied, her voice warm but tinged with modesty. I couldn't let it slide this time." Olivia nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Well, I'm glad you didn't. You said everything I've always wanted to say but couldn't." She hesitated, then added, "If you ever want someone to sit with, you don't have to sit alone." Amara's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Thanks, Olivia. I'll think about it." As Olivia walked away, another student, a boy named Marcus who sat at one of the quieter tables near the back, gave Amara a subtle nod of approval. It wasn't much, but it felt like an acknowledgement, a silent show of solidarity. Meanwhile, Tyler was grappling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The whispers around him weren't just about Amara, they were about him too. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding the room's attention in the way he wanted. His friends seemed distant, their earlier laughter replaced by uncomfortable silence. "Man, she really handed it to you," Ryan finally muttered, unable to keep quiet any longer. Tyler shot him a glare. "Thanks for the support," he said sarcastically. "I'm just saying," Ryan continued, shrugging. "Maybe you should have kept your mouth shut. That was rough." "Whatever," Tyler snapped, pushing his tray away. "It's not like she's some hero or something. She just got lucky." But deep down, Tyler knew it wasn't luck. Amara's words had struck a nerve, exposing insecurities he didn't want to confront. He hated how vulnerable it made him feel, and that hatred simmered just beneath the surface. As the lunch period wound down, the mood in the cafeteria shifted. Students began filing out in groups, their conversations still buzzing with the events of the day. Teachers and staff noticed the energy, their curiosity piqued as they overheard snippets of dialogue. Amara lingered for a moment at her table, gathering her things as the crowd thinned. She was aware of the attention she had drawn but refused to let it weigh her down. She had spoken her truth, and for now, that was enough. On her way out, she passed Tyler's table. He avoided her gaze, staring down at his phone, as if it could shield him from the judgment of the room. Amara didn't say anything she didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes, a quiet reminder that she had reclaimed her power. As she stepped into the hallway, Amara felt a mixture of exhaustion and pride. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her with a strange sense of calm. She didn't know what the long-term consequences of her actions would be, but she knew one thing for certain: she had taken a stand, and the ripple effect had already begun. The days following the cafeteria confrontation unfolded like ripples in a pond, the impact of Amara's words spreading far beyond what she could have imagined. Jefferson High had always been a place where the status quo went unchallenged, where people like Tyler could say what they wanted without consequence. But something had shifted. The air felt different, charged with a quiet but unmistakable sense of change. In classrooms, hallways, and locker-lined corridors, Amara's stand became the topic of conversation. Students who had witnessed the event retold it with reverence, their versions often exaggerated but carrying the same core truth: Amara had stood up to Tyler and won. In her English class, the teacher, Mr. Lawson, decided to steer the class discussion toward the themes of identity and courage. He stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped thoughtfully. Yesterday, something significant happened, he began, his tone calm but firm. And it got me thinking. Why do we allow cruelty to persist in our communities? Why do we stay silent when we see someone being treated unfairly? The question hung in the air for a moment, the class shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, Olivia, the girl who had approached Amara in the cafeteria, raised her hand. Because it's easier, she said quietly. If you speak up, you become a target too. Mr. Lawson nodded. That's a fair point. But what happens when no one speaks up? What's the cost of silence? Amara sat at her desk, listening intently as the discussion unfolded. Several students chimed in, some sharing their own experiences with being teased or excluded, others admitting that they had stayed silent in the past out of fear. For the first time, it felt like people were truly listening to one another, the barriers between them beginning to crack. Meanwhile, Tyler found himself on the receiving end of an entirely new experience, isolation. His friends, once eager to laugh at his jokes, now kept their distance. Maddie avoided sitting near him in class, and Ryan had started hanging out with a different group entirely. The cafeteria, once his stage, now felt suffocating. During lunch on Friday, Tyler sat alone at a corner table, his tray untouched. He glanced around the room, watching as the usual groups chatted and laughed, none of them sparing him a glance. His gaze lingered on Amara, who was seated with Olivia and a few other students. They were smiling, their conversation animated. For the first time, Tyler felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, regret, perhaps, or envy. He pulled out his phone, scrolling aimlessly, but the noise of the cafeteria felt louder than ever. Finally, he set his phone down, staring at his reflection in the shiny surface of his lunch tray. He hated how small he felt, how powerless. But deep down, he knew this was the result of his own actions. That afternoon, as the final bell rang and students spilled into the hallways, Tyler lingered by his locker. He watched as Amara walked past with Olivia, her laughter ringing out in the crowded hallway. Summoning every ounce of courage he could muster, Tyler called out, "Amara." She paused, turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a quiet strength that made him hesitate. Olivia glanced between them, her brow furrowed, but Amara gave her a slight nod, signaling it was okay. Olivia walked ahead, leaving them alone in the hallway. Tyler shoved his hands into his pockets, his gaze dropping to the floor. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said. For everything." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Why now?" He shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you were right. About everything. I was just trying to feel better about myself, and it wasn't fair. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway grew quieter as the crowd thinned, leaving them in an almost uncomfortable silence. Finally, Amara let out a soft sigh. "I appreciate the apology," she said, her tone measured but not unkind. "But Tyler, an apology doesn't erase the harm you caused. It's a start, but what really matters is what you do from here." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "Yeah, I get that." Amara regarded him for another moment before offering a faint, almost reluctant smile. "If you're serious about changing, prove it. Not to me, but to yourself and to everyone else you've hurt." Tyler nodded again, his expression a mix of gratitude and determination. "I will." The following week, Principal Munro made an announcement over the intercom. Her voice, usually clipped and professional, carried a note of warmth as she addressed the students. "Last week, we witnessed an important moment in our school's history, one that highlighted the importance of respect, empathy, and standing up for what's right. Starting this month, we'll be launching a new initiative to promote inclusivity and kindness within our community. I encourage all of you to get involved and be a part of the change." The announcement was met with mixed reactions, but for many, it felt like a step in the right direction. Teachers began incorporating discussions about empathy and bullying into their lessons, and student-led clubs focused on diversity and inclusion started to gain traction. Amara, though reluctant to be at the center of attention, found herself becoming a quiet leader in this new movement. She joined the Diversity Club, where she worked with students from all backgrounds to create initiatives that fostered understanding and respect. By the end of the semester, the atmosphere at Jefferson High had shifted. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of tension, still whispers of ignorance, but the walls that had divided the student body were beginning to come down. Conversations were happening, and for the first time, Amara felt like her voice and the voices of others like her were being heard. One afternoon, as Amara sat in the courtyard sketching in her notebook, Olivia and a few other friends joined her. They laughed and chatted, the autumn breeze rustling the pages of her sketchbook. Amara glanced around at her friends, a sense of peace settling over her. She thought back to that day in the cafeteria, to the choice she had made to stand up, to speak out. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Because sometimes, change didn't come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms, it came from one person daring to say, "Enough." Amara smiled, the sunlight catching her face as she turned her gaze back to her notebook. In her sketch she began to draw a single ripple expanding outward, growing larger with every stroke. Sometimes, all it took was one ripple to start a wave. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.